So Moscow has been very interesting. The, the development in the city over the last probably 15 years has been spectacular. What I found when I first started working in Moscow, we started working on some real estate development projects, and it was very difficult to get around the city. The traffic was horrendous. And at that date, it compared with cities like Dhaka in Bangladesh. When we go back there today, we find that Moscow really should compare more closely related to cities like Tokyo and New York, where they've made enormous strides in the use of ITS technologies in managing the traffic and integrating the transit together with development. So it's been a huge success. We see it in such areas as Moscow City and the traffic in and around the downtown. So Moscow, it's an interesting question because in my opinion, Moscow is somewhat of a hidden gem. It compares I find it very comparable to cities like New York and cities like Los Angeles. The interesting part of Moscow, though, is that they have an extraordinary high mobility split. So we've got about 75% of the population are on transit. So when you look at that, you really need to compare it to cities like Tokyo and Hong Kong, where Moscow compares, and as it's developing, as its plans are developing, will be very comparable to those cities, both in the opportunities that businesses have to develop in Moscow, given the very high population, as well as the ability to get around the city for the population of Moscow. So that's a different question altogether. There's more of a challenge there. So what we find is that countries and businesses in the West have a very jaundiced view of Moscow, and it's a very challenging view because we know that there's a political reality. You've got a political reality in the United States, there's a political reality in Moscow, and the risks of doing business there are seen to be very high. So one of the things that Moscow needs to do is really start addressing how do companies invest, how easy is it to invest in Moscow, how easy is it to repatriate your profits as an investor in Moscow, and to be able to demonstrate that there's a very stable tax and legal regime that will be supportive of corporations that invest in Moscow that are resident in other countries.